Learn English through story. Lies between the pages. The bookstore smelled of old paper and ink, a scent that clung to the walls and the worn wooden shelves. Eleanor Hastings had spent most of her adult life among these books, running the Gilded Page, a quaint little shop tucked away on a quiet London street. She believed that every book held a secret, a hidden truth waiting to be uncovered. And she had built a life around stories, both real and imagined. But Eleanor had secrets of her own, buried between the pages of her carefully curated life. One rainy afternoon, a stranger entered the shop, shaking water from his coat. He had the look of a man searching for something, perhaps a rare book, perhaps something else entirely. His name was Victor Langley, and his presence would unravel Eleanor's world in ways she could not yet comprehend. He approached the counter, his fingers tracing the edges of a leather-bound volume of Great Expectations. "You have an impressive collection," he remarked, his voice deep and measured. Eleanor studied him. There was something about his eyes and intensity that unsettled her. "Books are the best companions," she said lightly. "They don't judge, and they always reveal their truths in time." Victor smiled, but there was something unreadable in his expression. "Is that so?" He glanced around before leaning in slightly. "Then perhaps you can help me find a particular truth. I'm looking for a book that once belonged to my mother. A first edition, with a handwritten note inside. Do you believe books can hold secrets, Miss Hastings?" Eleanor's pulse quickened. She had heard those words before years ago, from someone she had tried to forget. A memory stir, one she had carefully locked away. But Victor's presence was like a key turning in an old lock. She kept her voice steady. "Books hold many things. Sometimes, things we wish they didn't." Victor's gaze held hers. "Then I suppose you know exactly what I mean." And just like that, the lies she had carefully woven into her life began to fray. As the days passed, Victor became a regular visitor. He searched the shelves with quiet determination, asking questions about rare books and the stories hidden within them. But Eleanor knew he wasn't just looking for a book. He was looking for answers. Answers that threatened to expose a past she had spent years burying. She had once been someone else, living a life far removed from this quiet bookstore. A life filled with deception, fridge letters, and a single betrayal that had shattered everything. One evening, as the rain tapped against the window panes, Victor placed a book on the counter, a first edition of Wuthering Heights. "This copy," he said softly, "was once in my mother's collection. She told me it was stolen years ago. The inscription inside. It's in your handwriting, isn't it?" Eleanor's breath caught. The past had finally caught up with her. Victor's voice was calm, but there was an undercurrent of something darker. "You see, Miss Hastings, my mother never told me the full story. Only that someone she trusted betrayed her. And now, after all these years, I need to know why." Eleanor closed her eyes. She had been young, desperate, and foolish. She had forged a letter that had led to heartbreak, a lie that had changed the course of another woman's life. And now, standing before her, was the consequence of that lie. The weight of unspoken truths filled the space between them. "What do you want from me?" she whispered. Victor studied her, the book between them like an unspoken accusation. "The truth." Eleanor hesitated, knowing that once spoken, the truth could not be undone. But perhaps, after all these years, it was time to set the record straight. And so, with shaking hands, she turned the pages of her past, ready to tell the story she had long tried to forget. The rain outside had softened to a whisper, as if the world itself were holding its breath, waiting for Eleanor Hastings to speak. She traced the edges of the book Victor had placed before her, her fingers lingering over the embossed title as though it could somehow shield her from the weight of what she was about to reveal. "The past is a dangerous thing to unearth," she said finally, her voice steady despite the storm within her. Victor did not move, did not press her. He merely waited, his patience as unsettling as his presence. Eleanor exhaled slowly and looked up at him. "Your mother's book did not end up here by accident, she admitted. "But before I tell you how, I need to know, what did she tell you about me?" Victor studied her with unreadable eyes, then leaned forward slightly. "She never mentioned your name," he said. "Only that someone she trusted betrayed her. That the betrayal cost her more than she could bear." He paused. "And that the proof of it was left behind in a book." Eleanor closed her eyes for a brief moment. So his mother had known, after all. Even after all these years, she had kept the memory of that betrayal alive. "You must think I'm some kind of thief," Eleanor said softly. "That I stole this book from her. Just another piece of some long-forgotten crime." Victor did not answer. She lifted her gaze to meet his. "But that's not the whole truth. It's never that simple." The past unfurled before her, a story long buried, written between the pages of a life she had tried to leave behind. Years ago, Eleanor had been a different person then. Young, ambitious, and hopelessly infatuated with the world of rare books. At 26, she had worked as an assistant in a renowned auction house specializing in rare literary artifacts. It was there that she met Margaret Langley, Victor's mother. Margaret was not just a collector. She was a scholar, a woman who understood books the way others understood human souls. She had a quiet grace about her, a patience that made Eleanor admire her almost instantly. They had worked together for several months, cataloguing some of the rarest first editions Eleanor had ever laid eyes on. But there had been another figure in Eleanor's life then, someone who had changed everything. A rival collector, charming and persuasive. James had been everything Eleanor had thought she wanted. He had swept into her life like a story unfolding at the turn of a page, promising adventure, romance, and, above all, success. He had introduced her to a world she had only dreamed of, a world where books were more than just artifacts. They were power. And then came the deception. James had convinced Eleanor to forge a letter, a seemingly innocent thing, just a small note, slipped between the pages of a rare first edition. The letter was meant to authenticate a book, to increase its value at an upcoming auction. "No one will ever know," James had told her, his voice like silk. "It's just a small lie, Eleanor, and we'll both benefit." She had hesitated, but James had been so sure, so confident. And in her naive desperation to impress him, to prove her worth, she had agreed. The letter had been placed inside a first edition of Wuthering Heights, the very book that now sat between her and Victor. But what she had not known, what James had conveniently failed to mention, was that the book already belonged to someone. Margaret Langley. The discovery had shattered everything. When the forgery was uncovered, Margaret had been humiliated. Her reputation, her years of careful scholarship, had been cast under suspicion. She had been accused of attempting to pass off a doctored book as authentic, even when the truth had come to light, that someone else had forged the letter. It had been too late. The damage had been done. Margaret had left the world of rare books soon after, disgraced, isolated, and Eleanor, overwhelmed by guilt, by the knowledge of what she had done, had disappeared as well. She had left the auction house, left James, left everything behind. She had opened the gilded page in an attempt to rebuild her life, to atone, in her own quiet way, for the lie that had destroyed another. But the past had found her anyway. Eleanor finished speaking and looked up at Victor. His expression had not changed, but there was something in his eyes, a flicker of something she could not name. "You were the one who placed the letter in the book," he said finally. Eleanor nodded. "Yes. You were the reason my mother lost everything." Her throat tightened. "Yes." Victor was silent for a long time. Then, finally, he exhaled. "She knew," he murmured. "All these years. She knew." Eleanor's fingers trembled slightly as she traced the book's worn cover. "I never had the chance to apologize to her," she said. "I wanted to, but I was a coward. And by the time I gathered the courage, she was gone." Victor's gaze darkened. "You don't get to feel sorry for yourself, Miss Hastings." She flinched. I know. The silence stretched between them, heavy with unspoken things. Then Victor did something she did not expect. He picked up the book, opened it to the first page, and read the inscription inside. It was written in elegant, slanted handwriting. To Margaret, who understands that books, like people, are never just one story. Victor ran his fingers over the words. Eleanor swallowed. That was written by your mother. Victor's jaw tightened. She never stopped loving books, he said. Even after everything. He looked up at Eleanor. Even after you. Eleanor did not speak. For the first time in years, she did not know how this story would end. Eleanor did not know. She only knew that the past could not be rewritten. But perhaps, just perhaps, the future could. Victor Langley sat in silence, the book resting on his lap like a delicate relic from another life. He had come searching for a stolen truth. But now that he held it, he wasn't sure what to do with it. The quiet hum of the gilded page felt almost sacred, like a church where sins were confessed between the pages of forgotten stories. Eleanor Hastings had just laid bare the deepest, most shameful part of her past, and now the weight of it hung between them like an unfinished sentence. Eleanor stood on the other side of the counter, her hands resting on the polished wood, fingers barely touching the surface as if grounding herself. She had prepared for this moment in her head 1,000 times what she would say, how she would justify the choices she had made, but now, standing before the son of the woman she had wronged, she found that all the rehearsed words had abandoned her. I didn't come here looking for an apology, Victor said at last, breaking the silence. His voice was quiet, but there was something in it, something measured, as if he were weighing each word carefully before speaking it. I came for the truth, and you've given me that. Eleanor's fingers twitched. Does that make a difference? He let out a slow breath, flipping through the pages of the book absent-mindedly, as if searching for something more than just words printed on paper. It should, he admitted, but I don't know if it does. Eleanor wanted to tell him that she understood. That guilt didn't simply dissolve with the truth. That even after all these years, she still woke up some mornings feeling the weight of what she had done pressing against her, ribs like a stone she could never quite shake free. I loved your mother, she said instead, not in the way that you love family, but in the way you love someone who changes your life. She taught me everything I knew. She trusted me. She swallowed hard, and I ruined her. Victor met her gaze, and for the first time, she saw something other than anger there, something softer. My mother was resilient, he said. Even after what happened, she never stopped reading. She never stopped collecting books. She just stopped trusting people. His voice caught slightly on the last word, and Eleanor felt it like a dagger to the heart. I know there's nothing I can say that will fix what I did, she said. But if there is anything I can do now, anything to make this right. Victor let out a short, humorless laugh. Make it right. He shook his head. You can't give her back the years she lost, the humiliation she endured. You can't rewrite the past, Eleanor. She flinched at the sound of her name from his lips. It was the first time he had said it. I know, she whispered. Victor stood, closing the book gently, as if careful not to damage something so fragile. What do you think she would say if she were here? Eleanor exhaled slowly. I think she would tell you to let go of the anger, she said honestly. Not for my sake, but for yours. Victor studied her for a long moment, then looked down at the book in his hands. I don't know if I can. She nodded, as if she understood because she did. Victor turned toward the door, but before he left, he paused. You built your life around books, he said. You believe they tell the truth in the end. So tell me, Eleanor, if this were a story, how would you want it to end? Eleanor's throat tightened. In forgiveness, she said, even if it's undeserved. Victor held her gaze for another long moment before finally walking out into the rainy London evening. The bell above the door chimed softly as he left, and Eleanor stood in the empty shop, listening to the sound of the rain. She did not know if he would ever come back, But as she looked down at the counter, she saw that he had left the book behind. A sign, perhaps. A possibility. A page not yet turned. And for the first time in years, Eleanor allowed herself to hope. The rain outside drummed softly against the windows of the gilded page, a rhythmic echo of the storm that raged within Eleanor. She stood frozen behind the counter, staring at the book Victor had left behind. Wuthering Heights, the book that had once been at the center of her greatest betrayal. Now, it sat in front of her, heavy with meaning, with history, with the remnants of a past she had tried so hard to leave behind. She reached for it hesitantly, her fingers skimming the edges of its worn leather cover. It was strange how something so small, so seemingly insignificant, could hold the weight of an entire lifetime of regret. She opened it slowly, turning to the first page where Margaret Langley's inscription remained. To Margaret, who understands that books, like people, are never just one story. Eleanor traced the elegant script with trembling fingers. She could still hear Margaret's voice in her mind, gentle, wise, full of warmth. And yet, Eleanor had been the one to take that warmth away from her. She closed the book with a quiet thud and exhaled shakily. Victor had left, but his presence still lingered like an unfinished conversation. Would he ever return? Would he ever find it in himself to forgive her? She didn't know, but she knew one thing: she couldn't just let this be the end of the story. She had spent years hiding, pretending the past had no power over her. But now, for the first time, she had the chance to do something different, to stop running. And she would begin with Margaret. The next morning, Eleanor rose early. The city was still waking as she made her way through the rain-slicked streets, the damp air curling around her like ghosts of memories long buried. She had made her decision the night before. She needed to know more about Margaret Langley. She knew Victor's mother had left the literary world after the scandal, knew she had retreated into quiet solitude. But where had she gone? What had become of her in those years of exile? Her first stop was the British Library. It had been years since she had last stepped into its grand halls, and yet it felt as familiar as ever, the scent of aged parchment and ink greeting her like an old friend. She navigated through the archives, searching for anything she could find on Margaret, old articles, academic papers, even just a mention of where she had gone after disappearing from the public eye. Hours passed. The afternoon sun shifted behind the clouds, casting long shadows across the reading desks. Eleanor sifted through article after article, most of them detailing the scandal, how Margaret Langley had been accused of fraud, how her reputation had crumbled overnight. Then, finally, she found something different. An old interview. The headline read, "A Life Beyond Books, Margaret Langley on Finding Peace." Eleanor's breath caught as she scanned the text. Margaret had left London. After the scandal, she had retreated to a small coastal town in Cornwall, where she had opened a modest bookstore of her own, not to make a name for herself again, but simply to be surrounded by the stories she loved. Eleanor's heart clenched. After everything, Margaret had still turned to books for solace. And then, the final lines of the interview. "I've learned that not all betrayals come from cruelty. Some come from fear, from desperation, from mistakes made in youth. I have lost much in this life, but I choose not to carry anger with me. Instead, I let the pages turn, as they always do." Eleanor pressed her fingers against the page, her throat tight with emotion. Margaret had forgiven her. She had never known it, had spent years believing that her crime was irredeemable. And yet, here was the proof: Margaret had chosen to let go, even when Eleanor had not. A tear slipped down her cheek, landing on the fragile paper. She wiped it away quickly and closed the file. It wasn't too late. That evening, Eleanor sat at the small writing desk in the back of her shop, pen poised over a fresh sheet of paper. She had never been good with spoken apologies, but written words, those, she understood. She began writing. "Dear Victor, I do not expect you to forgive me. I do not expect you to forget, but I need you to know the truth, that your mother was a better person than I ever deserved. I spent years believing I had destroyed her, that my betrayal had cost her everything. But today, I learned that she chose to move forward. She found a life beyond what happened, beyond what I did. And though I never had the courage to face her myself, I want you to know that she forgave me long before I ever forgave myself. I have spent my life surrounded by books, believing that they hold the truth. But the truth is not always in the stories. We tell it is in the ones we choose to rewrite. If you ever wish to rewrite ours, I will be here. She signed her name and folded the letter carefully, slipping it inside a cream-colored envelope. But when she looked at Victor's name on the front, a hesitation crept over her. Would he read it? Would he care? Or was it too late? For a long moment, she simply held the letter, letting the weight of it settle in her hands. Then, finally, she placed it in the wooden box by the door, the one where letters were meant to be sent out with the morning mail. Perhaps he would read it. Perhaps he wouldn't. But at least she had written it. At least she had tried. Weeks passed. The seasons shifted, the days growing colder. Eleanor continued running the gilded page, continued living her quiet life. Then, one evening, as she was locking up the shop, the bell above the door chimed. She turned. Victor stood in the doorway, a letter in his hand. Eleanor's breath caught. For a long moment, they simply looked at each other. Then, finally, Victor stepped inside. He held up the letter, the very one she had written. I received this, he said. His voice was unreadable. And I read it. Eleanor swallowed hard, and Victor exhaled. You were right about my mother. She forgave you long before you forgave yourself. His gaze softened slightly. And I think she would want me to do the same. Eleanor's heart ached at his words. She had spent so long believing she would never hear them. Victor placed the letter down on the counter. But forgiveness isn't forgetting. And it isn't easy. Eleanor nodded. I know. A beat of silence. Then, Victor reached into his coat and pulled out Wuthering Heights, the book he had once left behind. He placed it gently in front of her. You should keep this, he said, not as a reminder of the past, but as a promise to do better. Eleanor's fingers curled around the book. Victor turned toward the door, but before he left, he glanced back at her. Maybe, one day, we'll rewrite this story. Then he was gone, and Eleanor, for the first time in years, felt the weight of her past begin to lift. The pages were turning, and this time she was ready for what came next. Eleanor stood in the dim glow of the gilded page, staring at the door long after Victor had left. His words lingered in the air like the final lines of a novel unfinished, yet filled with possibility. Maybe, one day, we'll rewrite this story. She ran her fingers over the cover of Wuthering Heights, her grip tightening. The book that had once symbolized her greatest regret now carried the weight of something different hope. It wasn't a clean slate, wasn't an erasure of the past, but it was something, a promise, however fragile. She exhaled, feeling the tension in her chest loosen just slightly. But even as a small lightness crept in, doubt whispered at the edges of her mind. Could she truly atone for what she had done? Could she ever rebuild the trust she had broken? The past could not be undone. But perhaps, if she was willing to try, it could be rewritten. And she would start now. The next morning, Eleanor rose early, her mind already set on the next step. If she was going to truly move forward, she needed to understand more about Margaret Langley, not as a victim of betrayal, but as a woman who had lived beyond it. She packed a small bag and locked up the shop. Her destination was clear. The train ride was long, the countryside shifting outside her window like pages turning in an old book. She watched as London's grey skyline melted into the rolling green, fields and cliffs of the coast, the sea glistening under the autumn sun. By the time she arrived in the quiet seaside town Margaret had once called home, the air was crisp with the scent of salt and old stories. The town was small, lined with narrow streets and worn cobblestones, the kind of place where history lingered in the cracks of every building. Eleanor had no address, only the mention of a bookstore Margaret had once owned. She wandered the streets, asking shopkeepers, tracing old memories through newspaper clippings she had found in the archives. Finally, she found it. A small, unassuming shop tucked between a bakery and a gallery. The sign above the door was faded, but still legible, Langley's Books. Her breath caught. Margaret had truly built a life here. The bell chimed as she stepped inside. The scent of old paper and ink welcomed her, and for a moment, she could almost imagine Margaret standing behind the counter, smiling as she organized books by theme rather than title, as she always preferred. But it wasn't Margaret who greeted her. An older woman, perhaps in her 60s, looked up from a stack of books she was sorting. She had a warm but curious expression, as if she recognized Eleanor without knowing why. "Can I help you?" the woman asked. Eleanor hesitated, then took a deep breath. As she swallowed, "I was looking for information about Margaret Langley. She used to own this shop, didn't she?" The woman's face softened. "You knew her?" Eleanor nodded slowly. "A long time ago." The woman studied her, then gestured for Eleanor to sit. "Margaret was a dear friend of mine. I took over the shop after she passed." Eleanor's throat tightened. Nearly 5 years now. Eleanor felt the weight of those words press against her chest. 5 years. 5 years in which she had been living in the past, carrying her guilt like a burden that Margaret had long since let go of. 5 years in which she could have reached out, could have sought forgiveness, could have said all the things she had left unsaid. But now, Margaret was gone. The woman behind the counter seemed to sense the shift in Eleanor's expression. "I take it you didn't know." Eleanor shook her head slowly, her fingers tightening around the strap of her bag. "No, her voice wavered. "I didn't." The woman studied her carefully, then gestured toward a small, reading nook in the corner of the shop, where an old armchair sat beside a table stacked with books. "Sit with me a while," she said. "Tell me how you knew Margaret." Eleanor hesitated. She had not expected this, had not planned for it. But something about the woman's gentle tone made her nod, and she followed her to the quiet corner of the shop. As they sat, the woman folded her hands in her lap. "My name is Judith, by the way," she said. "I was one of Margaret's closest friends here in town. We used to run this shop together before she fell ill." Eleanor swallowed. "What happened?" "Cancer." Judith's voice was soft, touched with the quiet grief of someone who had already made peace with loss. She didn't tell many people until the very end. That was just like her, though. Never wanted to be a burden to anyone. Eleanor looked down at her hands, her heart aching. She was always like that. Judith studied her. "You knew her before she came here." It wasn't a question, it was an observation. Eleanor exhaled. "Yes." She hesitated, then decided there was no point in hiding the truth. "I was the reason she left London." A flicker of recognition passed through Judith's eyes. "You were the one," she murmured, as if a long unanswered question had just been solved. Eleanor's throat tightened. "Yes." Judith didn't look angry, nor did she judge. She simply sighed, nodding as if she had suspected as much. "She never spoke of it much," she admitted. "Only once, really. She told me she had lost something dear to her in London. But she also said she had no regrets about leaving. She said it gave her a second chance to live the way she wanted to." Eleanor blinked, her heart aching. "She never blamed me." Judith smiled sadly. "No, Margaret wasn't one to hold on to bitterness. She believed in turning the page, in moving forward. She said mistakes were only chapters in a much longer book." Eleanor closed her eyes for a moment, absorbing those words. It was so like Margaret to choose grace over resentment, to rebuild a life rather than dwell on what had been lost. After a moment, she reached into her bag and pulled out the letter. She had written to Victor, the one she had copied before sending the original. She unfolded it carefully, smoothing the creases with trembling fingers. "I came here to understand her," she admitted, "to find a way to make things right." Judith reached out, resting a hand on Eleanor's. "I think you already have," she said gently. "You're here, aren't you?" Eleanor nodded slowly, her throat thick with emotion. Judith stood and walked to a bookshelf near the counter. After a moment, she pulled down a small, leather-bound journal and returned to Eleanor, placing it gently in her hands. "This belonged to Margaret," she said. "She wrote in it often during her years here. I think you should have it." Eleanor hesitated, overwhelmed by the weight of the gift. "Are you sure?" Judith nodded. "I think she would have wanted you to read it." Eleanor swallowed hard, then clutched the journal close. For the first time in years, she felt something shift inside her, something she hadn't even realized she had been waiting for. A door had opened. A new chapter had begun. That evening, Eleanor sat in a small inn overlooking the sea, the waves crashing against the cliffs below. The journal rested on the table beside her, its leather cover worn with time. She hesitated before opening it, afraid of what she might find. But then she took a deep breath and flipped to the first page. Margaret's handwriting was the same as she remembered, elegant, precise, filled with warmth. "To whoever finds this," the first entry read, "I have spent too many years fearing the past, but I have come to realize that stories are not meant to be rewritten. They are meant to be understood. So this is my story, as I choose to tell it, not as a tragedy, but as a journey." Eleanor's breath caught, her fingers trembling as she turned the page. The entry spanned years, chronicling Margaret's new life, the quiet joys of running the bookshop, the friendship she had built, the peace she had found in the simplicity of seaside living. But there were also passages about the past, about loss, about betrayal, about the pain she had carried. And then, near the end, Eleanor found the entry that shattered her. "I have made peace with what happened in London. I do not hold anger in my heart for Eleanor. I never have. I only hope that one day she will forgive herself." Tears blurred Eleanor's vision. She pressed a hand to her mouth, letting out a quiet, broken breath. Margaret had already given her what she had been searching for. Forgiveness had been there all along. The next morning, Eleanor stood on the cliffs overlooking the sea, Margaret's journal held tightly in her hands. The wind tugged at her hair, the scent of salt thick in the air. She had spent years believing her story had ended the day she betrayed Margaret. But now she knew better. Margaret had turned the page. And now, Eleanor would, too. She reached into her bag and pulled out another letter, one she had written the night before. A letter not to Margaret, not to Victor, but to herself. "Eleanor, it is time. You have lived in the past for too long. But the past is not where stories end. It is where they begin. Margaret forgave you. Now, forgive yourself." She folded the letter carefully and held it up to the wind. For a moment, she hesitated. Then, with a deep breath, she released it. The wind carried it away, over the cliffs, out to the sea. And Eleanor, for the first time in years, felt free. She turned and walked back toward the town, toward the life that still awaited her. The past was a story she would always carry. But now, at last, she was ready to write a new one. Eleanor returned to London with a newfound clarity, though the weight of the past still lingered at the edges of her thoughts. The gilded page felt different now, not a refuge to hide from the past, but a place where she could start again. She had spent years curating stories, arranging books for customers, recommending novels that might change their lives. But for the first time, she was thinking about her own story, how she had been stuck between the pages of regret, afraid to turn to the next chapter. As the days passed, she found herself returning to Margaret's journal. Late at night, by the dim glow of a single lamp, she would read her words over and over, absorbing their wisdom, their kindness. Margaret had written about love, about betrayal, about the things she had lost and the things she had chosen to keep. One particular passage stood out. "We do not get to erase our mistakes, nor should we want to. They shape us as much as our joys do. The only thing we control is what we do next. And that is where the true story begins." Eleanor traced the words with her fingers, breathing them in. It was time to decide what came next. One afternoon, as Eleanor was sorting through a new shipment of books, The bell above the shop door chimed. She looked up, expecting a customer. Instead, she saw Victor. Her heart gave a painful jolt. He stood in the doorway, holding something in his hands. A letter. Eleanor set down the book she was holding, steadying herself. You came back. Victor nodded, but didn't step further inside just yet. I wasn't sure if I should, he admitted. But then I thought, maybe it's time. Eleanor swallowed, unsure of what to say. She wanted to ask him if he had found peace, if he still carried the hurt she had inflicted, if he truly believed what he had said before that they could rewrite this story. Instead, she simply gestured to the letter. What is that? Victor hesitated, then stepped forward and placed the envelope on the counter. It's something my mother wrote, he said. A long time ago. Eleanor frowned. To you. Victor shook his head. To you. A breath hitched in Eleanor's throat. She stared at the envelope, her hands shaking as she reached for it. The paper was aged, the ink slightly faded, but the name scrawled across the front was unmistakable. Eleanor. She looked up at Victor, her voice barely above a whisper. Why didn't I ever receive this? Victor exhaled. She wrote it just before she left London. She debated sending it, but in the end, she decided it was up to you whether you wanted to hear from her again. So she left it with me. Eleanor blinked, stunned. And you never thought to give it to me. Victor's jaw tightened. I wasn't ready to let go. Not back then. I wanted you to suffer the way she had suffered. But after reading your letter, I realized I was holding on to something she had already let go of. Eleanor felt a lump rise in her throat. You're giving it to me now. Victor nodded. Because it's time. She hesitated only a moment before carefully opening the envelope. The letter inside was written in Margaret's elegant, precise handwriting. She began to read. My dearest Eleanor, if you are reading this, then perhaps you have finally come back to yourself. Perhaps you have found a way to forgive, not only me, but yourself. I have long since let go of anger, of pain, of the past. But I worry that you have not. I want you to know that I do not hate you. I never did. You were young, afraid, and human. We all make choices we regret. But regret should not be a home, it should be a lesson. And once we learn it, we must move forward. I do not expect you to seek me out, nor do I expect you to make amends. But I do hope that, one day, you will find peace. Because despite everything, I've always believed in you. Turn the page, Eleanor. There is still so much left to write. With love, always. Margaret. Eleanor's hands trembled as she lowered. Eleanor's days began to feel different, lighter, though not without the weight of history pressing against her shoulders. Each morning, she unlocked the gilded page with a steadier hand, dusting the shelves with the sense of purpose she hadn't felt in years. The past was still there, lingering in the corners of her mind, but it no longer held her hostage. She had turned the page. Yet, turning the page didn't mean the story was finished. Victor's presence in her life was no longer an anomaly, no longer a ghost of past grievances come to haunt her. He came into the shop often, always at odd hours, never announcing his arrival. Sometimes he browsed in silence, his fingers tracing the spines of books, the way one might trace the outlines of old memories. Other times, he lingered near the counter, making conversation that still carried an edge of hesitation, as if neither of them quite knew what this new version of their relationship was supposed to be. But it was something. One evening, as Eleanor was closing up the shop, Victor remained behind, flipping through Wuthering Heights. The worn cover rested in his hands like a piece of their shared past tattered, yet enduring. You never told me, he said suddenly, breaking the silence. Why this book? Eleanor paused, her fingers stilling on the lock of the front door. She turned, taking in the sight of him standing beneath the soft glow of the bookstore's lamps, his expression unreadable. She sighed, leaning against the counter. It was the book that started it all. Victor smirked, but it lacked amusement. You mean the book that ended it all? Eleanor hesitated. I thought so, too. For a long time. Victor looked down at the pages, his voice quieter. And now? Eleanor swallowed, then said, now I think it was just a chapter. A painful one. But not the end of the story. Victor exhaled, flipping a page absent-mindedly. I used to hate this book, he admitted, for what it represented, for the way it reminded me of everything I lost. Eleanor's heart clenched. And now? She echoed. Victor's gaze lifted, meeting hers. There was something softer in his expression. Something almost resigned, but not entirely bitter. Now, I think it's just a book, he said. And maybe it's time I stop letting it haunt me. Eleanor managed a small smile. That's progress, I suppose. Victor smirked faintly, but said nothing. Instead, he closed the book gently and placed it on the counter between them. A silence stretched between them. Not uncomfortable, but filled with unspoken words. Finally, Victor straightened, running a hand through his hair. I should go. Eleanor nodded. See you around. Victor hesitated, then gave a small nod before stepping out into the London night. Eleanor exhaled, watching his silhouette disappear through the shop window. It wasn't closure, not exactly. But maybe closure wasn't what they needed. Maybe they simply needed to keep moving forward, one step at a time. And so, Eleanor did. Months passed, and slowly, Eleanor allowed herself to exist outside of the shadow of her mistakes. She started hosting book readings at the Gilded Page, something she had always planned to do, but never quite had the courage for. At first, only a handful of people attended, mostly regular customers, who had grown fond of the little shop over the years. But word spread, and soon the bookstore became a gathering place for lovers of literature. For those who wanted to discuss stories that changed them, Eleanor found herself opening up more during these events, sharing pieces of herself in ways she never had before. One evening, during a discussion on redemption arcs in literature, an older man in the audience asked her a question that caught her off guard. Do you believe people can truly change? Eleanor hesitated, the weight of her own past pressing against her ribcage. Then, she smiled, her answer coming easier than she expected. Yes, she said. I think we are all stories still being written. And the best ones don't end where we expect them to. The man nodded thoughtfully, and the conversation continued. But long after the event had ended, Eleanor thought about her own words. Maybe she was finally starting to believe them. One evening, Victor arrived at the Gilded Page unannounced, as he often did. This time, though, he didn't linger in the aisles. He walked straight to the counter, a determined set to his jaw. Eleanor looked up from the ledger she had been reviewing, arching a brow. No book browsing today. Victor shook his head, setting a small package on the counter. No, this is for you. Eleanor blinked. What is it? Victor hesitated, then gestured for her to open it. Curious, she carefully unwrapped the brown paper, revealing a first edition copy of Wuthering Heights. Her breath caught. Victor! He rubbed the back of his neck, looking uncharacteristically awkward. I found it in an antique shop, he said. Figured you'd appreciate it more than I would. Eleanor ran her fingers over the embossed title, something warm unfurling in her chest. It's beautiful, she murmured. Victor exhaled. I wanted you to have it. A fresh start, I guess. A new version of the story. Eleanor looked up at him, something unsaid passing between them. She swallowed. Thank you. Victor gave a small nod. You're welcome. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then, finally, Eleanor closed the book gently and smiled. Would you like to stay for tea? She asked. Victor hesitated. But then, for the first time in a long time, he smiled back. Yeah, he said. I'd like that. The story goes on. Time moved forward. Eleanor and Victor never tried to return to who they once were. Instead, they built something new, something undefined, something fragile yet strong. There were no promises of sweeping romance, no grand gestures of absolution. Just two people healing in their own way. Just two people learning to exist in the present instead of the past. And maybe, just maybe, that was enough. As Eleanor placed the first edition of Wuthering Heights on the shelf, beside the old, worn copy that had once symbolized everything she had lost. She realized something. She was no longer trapped between the pages of regret. She was writing a new story, and this time she was going to make it count. Eleanor's life was no longer divided into before and after. It was simply now. For the first time in years, she allowed herself to embrace the present without the weight of past mistakes dictating her every move. The Gilded Page had become more than a bookstore. It was a second home to many, a place where people gathered to share stories, find comfort in words, and, like Eleanor, begin again. Victor continued to be a quiet presence in her life, though neither of them defined what they were to each other. They met for coffee now and then, discussing books, sharing fragments of their lives in cautious but genuine ways. Sometimes he would bring her rare books he found in old antique shops, always wrapped in the same brown paper, always handed to her with quiet sincerity. Eleanor never expected an apology from him, just as he never asked for one from her, because they both understood something now. Some wounds did not need to be reopened to be healed. Sometimes healing was simply choosing to move forward. One rainy evening, as Eleanor was closing the shop, she noticed an envelope tucked between the pages of the first edition. Wuthering Heights that Victor had given her. Frowning, she picked it up, unfolding the note inside. The handwriting was familiar Margaret's. Her breath hitched as she read the final words her friend had left behind. Eleanor, if you are reading this, then perhaps you have finally learned what I always hoped you would, that the past is not meant to hold us prisoner. That guilt is a heavy thing to carry, but it does not have to be carried alone. I have long since forgiven you. I only hope you have learned to forgive yourself. You once told me that books are meant to be read, not left unopened on a shelf. The same is true for life. So live, Eleanor. Write your story with courage. With love, always. Margaret. Eleanor pressed the letter to her chest, her eyes stinging with unshed hairs. She had spent years punishing herself for the past, convincing herself that she did not deserve happiness. But Margaret had seen the truth long before Eleanor had been ready to accept it. Forgiveness was not about erasing the past. It was about choosing to move forward despite it. It was time. One morning, as sunlight streamed through the shop's windows, Eleanor sat at the counter, a blank notebook before her. She had spent years surrounded by stories, but now it was time to write her own. Not about regret, not about guilt, but about hope, about second chances, about the possibility of a new beginning, no matter how late in life it came. She picked up her pen and began to write. The moral: the past does not define as our choices do. Regret is not a home, but a lesson. And once we learn from it, we must move forward. Forgiveness is not forgetting, nor is it erasing mistakes. It is choosing to let go of the pain, to step into the future with an open heart. We are all stories still being written, and the best ones don't end where we expect them to.